The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked quietly through the ancient corridors. At 11 years old, he had already learned to navigate the palace with the careful steps of someone who understood the weight of tradition that surrounded him. The young prince was not like other children his age. While his classmates worried about homework and weekend plans, George carried the knowledge that someday these walls would be his responsibility. On this particular Tuesday morning, something felt different in the air. The usual bustle of palace staff seemed more subdued, and even the birds in the royal gardens sang with less enthusiasm. George noticed these things because his mother, the Princess of Wales, had taught him to observe the world around him with compassion and understanding. As he made his way toward the library for his morning tutorial session, George passed by the main entrance hall where the household guard stood at attention. These men and women had dedicated their lives to protecting the royal family, standing for hours in perfect formation, their faces hidden behind the iconic bearskin hats that had become symbols of British tradition. Among them stood Sergeant William Hayes, a man who had served the crown for over 15 years. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect. But George's keen eyes noticed something that others might have missed. There was a slight tremor in the sergeant's hands, and despite the cool morning air, beads of perspiration dotted his forehead beneath the heavy ceremonial hat. George had seen Sergeant Hayes many times before. The man had been part of the guard detail during countless royal events, state visits, and family gatherings. He was known among the staff for his unwavering dedication and his gentle manner with the younger members of the royal family. Unlike some guards who maintained strict professional distance, Sergeant Hayes had always offered George a small, barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement when their paths crossed. The young prince paused in the doorway, watching as the sergeant swayed almost imperceptibly. Years of observing adult behavior had taught George to recognize when something was wrong. His governess often spoke about the importance of noticing when people were struggling, even when they tried to hide it. She had explained that true leadership meant caring for those who served, not just accepting their service. As George continued to watch, he remembered a conversation he had overheard between his parents just weeks earlier. They had been discussing the pressures faced by palace staff, particularly the guards who were expected to maintain their posts regardless of personal circumstances. His father had mentioned how the tradition of stoic service sometimes prevented people from asking for help when they needed it most. The library could wait. Something in George's young heart told him that this moment required his attention. He had been raised to understand that with privilege came responsibility, and that responsibility extended to everyone within the palace walls. His great-grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth, had often spoken about duty, but she had also emphasized the importance of compassion and human kindness. Moving closer, George could see that Sergeant Hayes was clearly unwell. The man's breathing appeared labored, and his usual perfect posture was beginning to falter. Yet, true to his training and dedication, the sergeant remained at his post. This was the code of the guard, to stand firm regardless of personal discomfort or hardship. George understood the delicate nature of the situation. Palace protocol was strict, and guards were not supposed to be approached casually during their duties. However, the young prince had spent enough time around these traditions to know when humanity should supersede protocol. His mother had always taught him that rules were important, but caring for people was more important. The boy's mind raced as he considered his options. He could alert a member of staff, but that might take time and could potentially embarrass the sergeant. He could simply walk away and pretend he hadn't noticed, but that would go against everything his parents had taught him about responsibility and compassion. Or he could trust his instincts and approach the situation with the kind of quiet dignity that his family was known for. Making his decision, George stepped forward. His approach was slow and thoughtful, giving the sergeant time to notice his presence without startling him. The other guards remained at attention, but George could sense their awareness of the developing situation. Palace staff had learned to trust the young prince's judgment, even at his tender age. When George finally stood before Sergeant Hayes, the difference in their heights was striking. The 11-year-old prince looked up at the tall guard, whose face was partially obscured by the shadow of his bearskin hat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of mutual respect and understanding. Sergeant Hayes attempted to maintain his stoic composure, but George's compassionate gaze seemed to see right through the professional facade. The sergeant had served through countless ceremonies, state functions, and royal events, but he had never experienced anything quite like this moment. Here was a child, born into unimaginable privilege, showing genuine concern for his well-being. The other guards watched from their peripheral vision, maintaining their posts while witnessing what would become one of the most talked-about moments in recent palace history. Staff members who happened to be passing through the hall slowed their steps, sensing that something significant was unfolding. George's voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but clear. His words carried the kind of authority that comes not from position alone, but from genuine care and wisdom beyond his years. The young prince had inherited more than just titles and privilege. He had inherited a deep understanding of what it meant to serve others, even when you were the one being served. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as a moment that perfectly captured the true essence of royal duty. It wasn't about ceremony or tradition or maintaining appearances. It was about recognizing the humanity in others and responding with grace and compassion. George's actions in those next few moments would demonstrate that true nobility comes from the heart, not from bloodlines or titles. The morning sun continued to stream through the tall windows of Windsor Castle, but its light now illuminated a scene that would be etched in the memories of all who witnessed it. This was the moment when a young prince showed the entire palace what real leadership looked like. George looked up at Sergeant Hayes with eyes that seemed far older than his 11 years. The sergeant's face, though partially hidden by his ceremonial hat, showed clear signs of distress. Sweat continued to bead on his forehead, and his breathing had become noticeably shallow. The young prince understood that this was not simply a case of discomfort from standing at attention. Something was genuinely wrong. Without breaking the respectful silence that surrounded the moment, George reached into his pocket and pulled out a small water bottle that his nanny had packed for him earlier that morning. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of palace protocol and royal tradition, it was revolutionary. Guards were expected to maintain their posts without assistance, and members of the royal family typically did not engage with staff during formal duties. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected offer. Here was the future King of England, offering him water with the same natural kindness that any child might show to someone in need. The gesture cut through years of formal training and protocol, reaching the basic human connection that exists between people who care for one another. George noticed the sergeant's hesitation and understood it completely. The man was torn between his physical needs and his duty to maintain protocol. The young prince had witnessed this internal struggle many times among palace staff, people who were so dedicated to their service that they often forgot to care for themselves. Speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, George addressed the sergeant directly. His words were simple, but carried the weight of genuine concern. He told the sergeant that he had noticed he wasn't feeling well and asked if he needed to sit down. The question was posed not as a command from a future monarch, but as an inquiry from one human being to another. The other guards remained perfectly still, but their attention was completely focused on the interaction taking place before them. They had all been in situations where they felt unwell during duty, but protocol had required them to push through regardless of personal discomfort. Watching their young prince show such consideration for one of their own touched something deep within each of them. Sergeant Hayes tried to respond in the formal manner that his training dictated, But George gently shook his head. The boy explained that they were not in a formal ceremony at the moment, and that his only concern was for the sergeant's well-being. This simple statement revealed a maturity and understanding that amazed everyone within earshot. Palace staff members who had gathered at a respectful distance watched in silent awe as the scene continued to unfold. Lady Morrison, the head housekeeper who had served the royal family for over 30 years, later said that she had never witnessed such a pure display of compassion from someone so young. The moment reminded her of the late Queen Elizabeth's own ability to put duty and care for others above all else. George continued to stand before the sergeant, patiently waiting for him to accept the offer of help. The boy's presence was calming rather than demanding. He didn't tap his foot impatiently or show any signs of wanting to be elsewhere. His entire focus was on ensuring that Sergeant Hayes received the care he needed. Finally, recognizing that the young prince would not be deterred from his mission of kindness, Sergeant Hayes made a decision that would change everything. He looked directly into George's eyes and quietly admitted that he wasn't feeling well. The confession was difficult for a man who had spent his entire career maintaining an image of unwavering strength and reliability. George's response was immediate and heartfelt. He thanked the sergeant for his honesty and gently suggested that he should step aside from his post to rest. But the sergeant's next words revealed the depth of his dedication and the complexity of his situation. He explained that he couldn't leave his position because it would break protocol and potentially cause problems for his fellow guards and the royal household. This moment crystallized everything that George had been learning about leadership and service. He realized that true authority wasn't about making people follow rules blindly, but about creating an environment where people felt safe to prioritize their well-being when necessary. His parents had taught him that the royal family existed to serve the people, not the other way around. What the young prince said next would be repeated throughout the palace corridors for years to come. His words were spoken with such quiet authority and genuine care that they transformed the entire atmosphere of the room. George told Sergeant Hayes that his health and safety were more important than any protocol, and that taking care of himself was actually the most important duty he could perform. The sergeant's eyes filled with tears at the unexpected kindness and understanding. In all his years of service, he had never experienced such compassion from a member of the royal family. The boy standing before him was offering not just permission to step down, but validation that his humanity mattered more than rigid adherence to rules. But George wasn't finished. Recognizing that the sergeant might still feel conflicted about leaving his post, the young prince made a decision that stunned everyone present. He positioned himself next to the sergeant and assumed a posture of respectful attention, indicating that he would stand guard himself if necessary. The gesture was unprecedented. Here was the future King of England, willing to take the place of a guard who needed medical attention. The symbolism was powerful and profound. George was demonstrating that service flowed both ways in the royal household, and that caring for others was the highest form of duty. Lady Morrison quickly stepped forward, understanding that while the prince's gesture was beautiful, it was important to ensure that proper medical attention was provided to Sergeant Hayes. She quietly suggested that they move to a nearby room where the sergeant could rest while palace medical staff was summoned. George nodded in agreement, but made it clear that he would personally ensure that Sergeant Hayes received whatever care he needed. The young prince's protective instinct had been awakened, and he was determined to see this situation through to a positive resolution. As they began to move toward the appointed room, other members of the guard detail watched with newfound respect for their young prince. They had always known him as a polite and well-mannered child, but this situation had revealed depths of character that impressed even the most seasoned palace staff. The morning's events were already beginning to spread throughout the castle, carried by staff members who had witnessed or heard about the extraordinary display of compassion. Word was reaching the ears of senior household members, all of whom recognized that something truly special had occurred. Within minutes, the palace medical staff had arrived to attend to Sergeant Hayes, but George refused to leave until he was certain the man was being properly cared for. The young prince sat quietly in the corner of the small anteroom while the medical team conducted their examination. His presence provided comfort not only to the sergeant, but to everyone involved in the situation. Dr. Patricia Wells, the palace physician, was impressed by both the prince's maturity and his genuine concern for the sergeant's well-being. She had treated many members of the royal household over the years, but she had rarely seen such personal involvement from a member of the royal family in the care of staff. George asked thoughtful questions about the sergeant's condition and listened carefully to the explanations. The medical examination revealed that Sergeant Hayes was experiencing symptoms of exhaustion and dehydration, conditions that had been exacerbated by his determination to maintain his post despite feeling unwell. Dr. Wells explained that with proper rest and care, he would make a full recovery, but that he had been wise to step down when he did. George's relief was visible and genuine. He approached the sergeant's bedside and spoke words that would be remembered by everyone present. He told Sergeant Hayes that his years of dedicated service had earned him the right to be cared for when he needed it, and that the royal family was honored by his commitment to duty. But more importantly, George added, they were grateful for his willingness to trust them enough to accept help. The sergeant, now resting comfortably and receiving proper medical attention, was overwhelmed by the young prince's continued concern. He had served the royal family for 15 years, but he had never felt as valued and respected as he did in this moment. George's actions had transformed what could have been a moment of professional embarrassment into an affirmation of dignity and worth. As word of the morning's events spread throughout Windsor Castle, it reached the ears of Prince William and Catherine, who were initially concerned that George might have overstepped boundaries or created complications. However, when they learned the full details of what had transpired, their concern transformed into deep pride for their son's compassion and wisdom. Catherine, in particular, was moved by George's instinctive understanding of when humanity should supersede protocol. She and William had worked hard to raise their children with an understanding of their privileged position and the responsibilities that came with it. This situation demonstrated that their efforts were succeeding in ways they had hardly dared to hope. Prince William's reaction was equally emotional. He remembered his own childhood experiences in the palace and how intimidating the formal protocols could sometimes feel. To see his son navigate such a delicate situation with grace and compassion filled him with admiration and hope for the future of the monarchy. Later that day, Prince William visited Sergeant Hayes personally to check on his recovery and to express the family's gratitude for his years of service. During their conversation, the sergeant shared his amazement at George's maturity and kindness. He described how the young prince had made him feel valued not just as a guard, but as a human being deserving of care and respect. The story of George's quiet gestures spread beyond the palace walls, though in carefully controlled ways that respected both the privacy of the individuals involved and the dignity of the moment. Senior palace officials recognized that this incident perfectly illustrated the values that the modern royal family sought to embody: service, compassion, and genuine concern for all people. Lady Morrison, who had witnessed the entire situation, later spoke with Catherine about the profound impact the incident had on the palace staff. She explained that George's actions had reminded everyone that the royal family's commitment to service extended to caring for those who served them. The gesture had created a new sense of mutual respect and appreciation throughout the household. In the days that followed, Sergeant Hayes made a complete recovery and returned to his duties with renewed energy and dedication. However, the experience had changed him in subtle but meaningful ways. He carried himself with a new confidence, knowing that his well-being mattered to the family he served so faithfully. George continued his daily routines and studies, but the incident had marked an important milestone in his development as a future leader. He had learned that true authority came not from commanding obedience, but from inspiring loyalty through genuine care and respect for others. His parents recognized that he had crossed an important threshold in his understanding of what it meant to serve as a member of the royal family. The other guards who had witnessed the morning's events found their respect for the young prince deepened considerably. They had always known him as a polite and well-behaved child, but now they saw him as someone who truly understood the value of their service and the humanity behind their uniforms. Palace staff began to share stories of small acts of kindness and consideration that George had shown over the years, moments that might have gone unnoticed but that demonstrated a consistent pattern of thoughtfulness and empathy. His governess noted that the prince seemed more confident in his interactions with staff members, as if the successful navigation of the situation with Sergeant Hayes had given him greater trust in his own instincts. The ripple effects of that morning's events continued to be felt throughout the palace community. Staff members found themselves more willing to speak up when they needed assistance or felt unwell, knowing that their concerns would be met with understanding rather than criticism. The incident had created a new atmosphere of mutual care and respect. Months later, when Sergeant Hayes was interviewed for a palace newsletter, he spoke about the lasting impact of George's gesture. He described how the young prince's willingness to put human needs before protocol had reminded him why he had chosen to serve the royal family in the first place. The incident had reinforced his belief that he was serving people who truly cared about others, not just about maintaining appearances. George's quiet gesture had indeed moved the entire palace, but perhaps more importantly, it had demonstrated that the future of the monarchy rested in capable and compassionate hands. The 11-year-old boy who had noticed a struggling guard and responded with immediate kindness had shown everyone present what true leadership looked like. His actions proved that the greatest strength of the royal family lay not in their titles or traditions, but in their capacity for genuine human connection and care for others. In the years to come, this moment would be remembered as a defining example of George's character and a hopeful sign for the future of the British monarchy. The young prince who had stepped forward to help when someone was in need had shown that the values of service, compassion, and human dignity would continue to guide the royal family for generations to come.